Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're covering Pearl Harbor, a 2001 film directed by Michael Bay and written by Randall Wallace. It was nominated for 4 Academy Awards and won 1 for Best Sound Editing and cost $140 million to make. And we'll definitely discuss whether that was a good investment. And it was actually filmed in Hawaii and, in fact, premiered on an aircraft carrier at Pearl Harbor.
I'm already giggling. Just saying.
Yeah, you guys should know that the reason why we're covering this movie is because this is a big nostalgia watch for Mart. She likes this movie.
I do like this movie. Or do I? I don't know if I like this movie. No, I do like this movie. Because I first saw it when I was 14 or something like that. I don't know. How old was I in 2001? I don't know. Young and stupid is what I was. No, but she's right. Sam's right. I really enjoyed this movie when I was 14. Not really caring about history as much. So now that I'm watching it again, it's a really enjoyable thing for me just because I remember what it was like being 14. But also knowing a lot more about history, it hits the same, but it hits kind of different. So it's really interesting to watch and to talk about.
Yeah.
How about you?
I mean,
Did you watch it when you were 14 as well? Or
you know what? I was sure I had seen this movie. In my mind, I had some vague recollection. I was like, you know what? It just wasn't that remarkable. That's why I don't remember it that well. And then as I was rewatching it last week in preparation for this, I was getting further and further into the movie. And I was like, there is no way my teenage ass sat through 3 hours of this. There's no way.
Well, my teenage ass must have seen this movie about 15 times.
You know what's funny? My movie like that I've seen, that I watched a million times as a teenager is Titanic. And I don't think those two movies are dissimilar. They both have the really romance level sort of first half, and then the back half is where all the hot, exciting action sequence happens.
Wow, that's a very good kind of comparison there. And even they're both like based on historical things as well.
Yes, exactly.
They both make up a bunch of shit, but it's still like teenage me really enjoyed that movie. And I'm trying to remember if I'd seen Titanic the same time, but I don't remember. I just remember having my own room, and I just got in a new room and a new TV and a DVD. Was it VHS or DVD at the time? I don't remember, but a new media player. Let's put it like that. No, I remember the opening scene so well that I must have watched it at least 15 times.
Well, I think my opinion on this movie is much like my opinion on Titanic, where weirdly, I feel like we've discussed this on the podcast before, that Titanic came on the 2 different VHS tapes. And I used to only watch the second one. I mean, of course, I watched the first one a few times, but I used to, if I only had time to watch a little bit, I would throw in the second VHS and skip right to the action. And I think if Pearl Harbor came on 2 VHSs, I would do the same thing because I didn't hate the back half, but the first half was a lot.
I know where we said this because we were comparing episode 1 of Band of Brothers to the first VHS of the Titanic, where I would just always skip it.
You know what? Everything in life ties back to James Cameron's seminal 1997 masterpiece, Titanic.
Well,
in this essay, I will...
Right. No, but anyway, let's get into what we came here to do today, which is the movie.
Absolutely. So just before we get into that, I just wanted to say that we are going to obviously talk about some of the real history, and I did some brushing up on said history. So I did some reading from the National World War II Museum, the Association for Asian Studies, and I also bought the National Geographic mini documentary Beyond Pearl Harbor. Those are some of the sources that we're using for the information that we're going to talk about today.
I'm just going to agree with it, just about anything you tell me. So
I need to tell you, okay, so you know this story, but I need to tell this story. So I decided I wanted to buy this Beyond Pearl Harbor DVD because all these different movie reviews kept referencing it. And I gather what happened was the year Pearl Harbor came out, National Geographic decided to capitalize on the popularity of the movie to try and teach us peons about history. So they made this little documentary about what was true in the movie and what was accurate, etc. And so I decided I got to see this DVD, but could not be found for love or money on the internet. And so I bought a used copy and had it shipped to me, and then realized that I don't have a DVD player or a way to watch a DVD. So I had to borrow my parents' DVD player. I got it to my house, was able to hook it up. Then I realized that I don't have a remote control and the DVD player only has like one button on it. So luckily I was able to hit play and watch it, but there were bonus features that I couldn't watch because I had no way to click over to them. And anyway, it was a whole process.
Wow, there's like a drama within a drama here. Like the movie's a drama, and then you had some drama trying to watch this
Yeah,
DVD.
certainly comparable amounts of drama. You're right, I would say. But anyway,
Speaking
that's how you know
of,
I'm committed.
yeah, very. I am also committed. I've watched the movie very committedly. I don't know if that's a word, but hence why I'm gonna start telling you what the movie's about in case you forgot, because it's not just about Pearl Harbor. In fact, when does Pearl Harbor start again in the movie? You've timed this.
I did. So I hit play at the exact moment the first torpedo hits the first ship, and it clocks in at, I believe, 1 hour, 28 minutes, and 26 seconds. So there's literally 90 minutes of content in a movie called Pearl Harbor before Pearl Harbor happens.
All right, so let me tell you about everything before Pearl Harbor because that's all I know, to be honest. I'm lying, I'm lying. I'll stop joking now. But I will start with the start of the movie. We start in 1923 in Tennessee, which is funny because that was originally going to be the title of the movie, apparently. I've just learned this.
I heard that it
Well,
was the secret name while they were filming. They didn't want anyone to know that it was about Pearl Harbor, so they called it Tennessee as like a cover.
all right, so like they have called Masters of the Air was called Project Whirlwind, I guess.
Yeah.
It was called Tennessee, okay. So IMDb then is wrong. So just saying, my sources are incorrect. It's fine. I'm gonna start. I'm gonna do lots of editing for this. But right. So 1923 in Tennessee, we meet our main characters, Rafe McCauley and Jenny Walker, who are played by Ben Affleck, who's Rafe, and Josh Hartnett, who plays Danny. We meet them before they're actually Josh Hartnett and Ben Affleck because they're kids, and they're on, I believe, Danny's farm, playing around in the fields and playing around on this homemade plane, pretending to be fighter pilots, which should tell you something about what they want to be when they grow up. And we kind of get to know them and we figure out that they're best friends. Rafe is pretty illiterate, which is funny because it's the reason he almost doesn't catch a fly, but then he gets saved by Evelyn, who's his loved one, who he then writes loads of beautiful letters, and it makes no sense. They play around in the plane for a bit, and then they get into their dad's actual plane and almost crash it. But it's the start of their friendship and the start of the movie for us. And then very suddenly after that, we skip a whole bit of their lives and we go to New York and England. We meet them in January 1941. Danny and Rafe are first lieutenants under the command of Major Jimmy Doolittle, as played by Alec Baldwin. And Danny is the quiet one, and Rafe is the stupid, reckless one.
Those are certainly the character archetypes, yes.
Yeah, like Danny's smart and quiet, and Rafe is loud and stupid, basically. And they are both very charming. And also, Ben Affleck has super white teeth. He's supposed to be a farm boy, and I don't believe it. But that's
Listen,
fine.
maybe he's a farm boy. He's really into dental hygiene.
Could be. But we kind of see them around the base and they do some heroic flying and some cool maneuvers, which apparently were made up by a stuntman, I believe, if I did my research correctly, which is very cool. Yeah, I do want to say I really enjoy the images of this movie and the planes, even if they're not always the correct planes. The flying scenes are really awesome.
Yeah, I agree.
Does Rafe meet his love interest in this bit? Also, I can't remember.
Yeah,
I think so.
There's actually, we encounter his love interest on a train, and she's telling all of her friends the story of how she met Rafe.
Thank you. That's thanks for putting me back on the track. Because they meet in a like a medical exam, and they're getting like shots because they have to go to war and they need all these shots. I don't know what for exactly, but Rafe sees her. She's very very pretty, so I can't really blame him. But he does something stupid. He's got his shots already. He goes over to her nurse's station because he wants to talk to her, and then because he's got no reason to talk to her, he decides to get another shot from her, and then continues to make a fool of himself and hit himself in the face with a tray, I believe. I don't remember, but he falls, and then they have a romance because he has to go off. Sorry, I'm just getting this all messed up now. He is
No, you're right. They have, so I don't know if we said her name. Her character's name is Evelyn Johnson, and she's played by Kate Beckinsale. And they have a brief 4-week courtship, and then he springs it on her that he had previously volunteered to go fight in Britain with the Eagle Squadron.
Yes, which apparently American enlisted men weren't allowed to join at this point in the war, right?
Yeah, and so there were, I think, 200, and I wrote this down somewhere, but I believe it was 244 Americans ended up fighting in the Eagle Squadron for the British before the Americans had officially entered the war, but they were all civilians. So Ben Affleck's character would not have been allowed to do this.
Right, but he's a rebel, so he's doing lots of shit he shouldn't be doing.
Quite, yes.
Quite. He is apparently inspired by a real man though, Joe Foss, which is I haven't been able to look up any more information, but apparently this guy was badass. So it's pretty cool. But my favorite scene is also in this bit of the movie, which is where after Ben Affleck has broken his nose on the table in the nurse's station, he waits for Evelyn outside of the, I don't know, I think outside of the hospital, and they have a little romantic moment in the moonlight. And he's brought like a bottle of champagne with him, and he pops the cork against his broken nose, and it's the funniest scene of the entire movie.
I also really enjoyed that. I actually thought their whole little meet cute, as cheesy as it was kind of precious. And I also thought the cork scene was funny.
And he's a good comedy actor, I want to say. Like, he pulled that scene out pretty well, I believe that. It's super cheesy, and there's lots of cheese in this entire movie, but it's still cute, you're right.
Yeah, it had its moments.
It definitely had its moments. And it should have stayed there, to be honest. But anyway, he then has to go off to Britain to join the war before he can actually enter the war. And he's shot down over the English Channel. And we think that's the end for him. We think he's dead. And I remember actually believing this as a child. I was like, no, die!
Yeah, I also thought that fighting scene was kind of neat. The way, it was pretty well done. The whole, I believe they're intercepting a German bomber crew. I think there's also some reference to it being during the Battle of Britain, but the Battle of Britain was over in 1940, and no Americans actually got there in real life till 1941. But that's okay. We can just hand wave these historical inaccuracies until later.
Sure. So he is presumed killed in action, and before he left, he asked his best friend Danny if he died overseas, if he could please go tell his girlfriend that he was dead. So Danny does this thing, but I'm gonna hand it over to Sam now.
Right. So Danny hears Rafe say, "Please go tell my girlfriend I'm dead," and what he hears is, "Please go make sweet, sweet love to my girlfriend," and that's what he does.
Like at first, they feel kind of guilty about it, and they're like, "We can't do this," blah blah blah, and then they do it anyway.
Right. So the next part of the movie takes us from February through November of 1941. We're in Hawaii, and we're seeing Danny and Evelyn become closer after Rafe's death. And they begin a romance. They end up sleeping together, and that's crucial because Evelyn never slept with Rafe. And so when she gets pregnant, it's obviously Danny's kid.
And we don't know she's pregnant yet, by the way, in the movie. We've got no clue. They've just been up they've been he sneaked her onto his plane first. They watched the sunset from the plane, which is pretty romantic, to be honest. And then they have interesting love in the hangar of the parachutes or something.
Yeah, they smash on a parachute.
Exactly, and it's all very pretty. So I want to say this entire movie is very pretty. Everything is beautiful.
It's true. There's some good cinematography, some nice shots, absolutely.
Yes.
So we're following this romantic liaison between Danny and Evelyn. And as that's happening, we're also getting a more macro view as we're getting closer and closer to this conflict between the United States and Japan. So we periodically see the Japanese point of view as they prepare to attack Pearl Harbor. The attack was masterminded in the movie and in real life by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and he was the fleet admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who's played by the actor Mako in the movie. And he's assisted in planning by Commander Minoru Genda, played by Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa in the movie. We also see a Japanese spy at one point who was actually based on a real person named Takeo Yoshikawa, played by Seth Sakai. And this spy posed as a vice consul in order to get into the United States, but he was actually the chief Japanese agent in Hawaii. And in real life, the story is actually kind of interesting because while he was on Hawaii, he was going around and just taking pictures of the planes and this and that. And he would go diving in the harbor and all that stuff, pretty much unimpeded.
I do have a question because I'm Dutch and I don't know what a vice consul means. So,
So it's like a diplomatic attaché, I gather, like someone who works in the embassy.
all right. Is he the one we see also taking photographs of everything? Is that the same guy?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Right.
And he actually, interestingly, in real life, so when Pearl Harbor happened, he immediately burned all of his incriminating documents. So he did end up getting picked up by the authorities, but they didn't have any proof that he had done anything, even though all the information that he had provided to the Japanese was integral in planning Pearl Harbor. So they let him go. He went back to Japan. But after the war, when people found out who he was, people held him responsible for causing the war and for Hiroshima and Nagasaki and everything that came later. So he wasn't able to hold down a job and he ended up relying on his wife and he really became a broken man. So they do, make reference to real historical figures in this movie, but the story was so much deeper and richer and more interesting when you look into it. So I thought that was really neat.
If you're watching this movie and you're younger, you have no idea who any of these people are. It's
Right.
not like you
Of
get
course.
like a play-by-play of who's who or anything.
Yeah,
Like, I feel
you're
pretty
right.
stupid because I've got no idea. Thankful for you. So now at least I get to know about these people.
Yeah, so we're not only getting the Japanese point of view, we're also seeing the highest echelons of American power. We see President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as played by John Voight, who in the movie thinks the US should be helping more with the war effort. And we see his war council and all his various government officials, and all of those are also all based on real people. We have General George C. Marshall, who is the US Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who is the US Naval Commander, who actually later became the Pacific Fleet's Commander in Chief, and Tom Everett, Secretary of the Navy. And we also have a codebreaker character played by Dan Aykroyd, who is basically an amalgam of many American codebreaker. So he wasn't a real person, but he was based on real people. And by early 1941, the Americans had broken the Japanese diplomatic code, but they couldn't read the code used by the Japanese Navy. So they were getting kind of a piece of the puzzle, but not all of it. And coded naval messages that were intercepted before Pearl Harbor actually remained undecipherable until the end of the war. And
Wow.
so in early December 1941, codebreakers like the one that Dan Aykroyd was based on, they were intercepting these messages to Japanese embassies, telling them to burn critical documents and destroy their code machines. So they knew that something was coming, that something was imminent. And they were also picking up, of course, this flurry of naval communiques, but they couldn't read them.
So they saw it coming, but they didn't know what exactly was coming. I did
Yeah.
really like his character in the movie, by the way. He seemed like at least took it seriously, which is
Yeah. I feel like there's quite a lot in the movie. They endeavor to give people a lot of credit. So, when we see, for example, the character played by Comfior, who is, I believe, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, they show him in the movie. He's getting these conflicting orders from Washington, and he doesn't have all the information he needs to make a good decision, but he seems like he knows that something's up. And they really try and make it so that the bad guy in this is, all these super higher up army guys who they don't want to believe that something's going to happen, and the whole bureaucracy and the machinery is too slow to prevent anything from happening. But in real life, Kimmel did receive some warnings. I mean, they were vague and incomplete, and he had limited information, but he ended up not placing the Pacific Fleet on full alert. And because of that, he was later blamed for not taking action. And he actually was asked to resign 10 days after Pearl Harbor. And that's when Admiral Chester Nimitz became the commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet.
Thank you for that update. I will try and remember it. I'll probably forget it again, but I'm sure we'll see another movie where it'll be relevant again. So, as is fitting, I will now be talking about the fluff again. Because we're on December 6th, 1941 in Hawaii still. And suddenly, guess who's back? It's Rafe. And he's at Evelyn's door, not dead after all. And he's kind of saying hello to his lover, and then suddenly there's also his best friend Danny, and it's like, what the fuck is going on? And they are kind of angry with each other for the rest of the movie, which is kind of sad, to be honest. I'm not sure if I can blame any of them for feeling any sort of way about this situation, because it's just a strange situation. But apparently Rafe was not able to send any message before because he was floating around in the sea for a while, and then he had to go through, I want to say Italy, but I don't remember. He does say it in the movie, but yeah, he gets picked up and then it takes him a long time to get back, obviously. But it's also, if you remember when Pearl Harbor was, the attack on Pearl Harbor, we're getting closer now. What I'm trying to say.
At this point when I was watching the movie, we were like an hour and 20 minutes in, and Rafe and Danny are mad at each other. Well, Rafe's mad at Danny for shacking up with his girlfriend, and they're having this little beach party, and then they have a fist fight. And I was like, oh my God, why is this Ben and Josh's beach adventure right now? Like, when is Pearl Harbor going to happen? What is going on? Did the Japanese get lost? What are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, the Americans definitely seem to think at this point that they are lost because they keep saying they might be there and there, but we don't know, and they might not be there, so they've got no clue, at least in the
Yeah. One
movie.
thing I thought this movie did pretty well was when I was watching this National Geographic documentary, they interviewed a lot of nurses and army personnel and all kinds of different people who were stationed on Hawaii before Pearl Harbor. And they were all talking about how they were living this like idyllic Hawaiian lifestyle, and there was lots of romance, and people were going dancing, and they were partying and drinking and having a good time. And Pearl Harbor was a real rude awakening. So I thought the movie did a pretty good job of kind of putting us in that mind frame with these guys.
It's true. They don't see it coming, and not. To be honest, if you're 14, neither do you at this point. You're like, I guess it won't happen. I guess it's just party at this. We're just gonna have a party. Just gonna be a good time. But then it's December 7th. That's when the attack on Pearl Harbor begins. So the Japanese launch a very much surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and it damages the Pacific Fleet and also the airfields around it. See Rafe and Danny, I'm just reading your lines because they're funny. See Rafe and Danny doing heroic stuff in planes, which is true. And actually they are at the beach together because they've just been fighting, and then they're lying around in their car, and then the attack happens, and they are just driving over to their little airfield away from the harbor, trying to get into a plane, and most of their friends at this point have like been blown up by the Japanese. And they do some cool shit in planes, is what happens. And we see some boats being blown up. Ships, I should say, sorry. And there's actually a real character who was a real life hero in this movie as well, who is petty officer second class, apparently actually petty officer third class in real life, Doris Miller, played by Cuba Gooding Jr. And I looked this up. He was the first black man to be awarded the Navy Cross for what he did in Pearl Harbor. And he was a cook, I believe, on one of the vessels.
Just about Doris Miller, at the time, Black people were only 2% of the personnel in the Navy in 1941, and they were confined to the lowest jobs. But as the war went on, they started to be trained for combat roles and started to be promoted later on in the war. More than 1 million African Americans served during World War II. There was also kind of a sad footnote to the Doris Miller story. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
There definitely is a sad ending to the story of Doris Miller. because he did not make it to the end of the war. He was reported missing in action in November of 1943 when he was apparently torpedoed during a battle of Macon Island.
Yeah, he was killed in action, and that was it.
And I do like his scenes in the movie. I really enjoy his relationship that he has with his captain. It's very wholesome. And also, the captain is dying, and he's being very sweet and reassuring about his captain, and he's not let them down. And it's, I don't know, I kind of like it. I kind of like that bit of the movie.
So I also liked that scene. It was one of the moments where I got a small branch poking me right in the eye. I'm convinced
Yes,
that's what it has to be because I definitely didn't cry in this movie. No, sir.
lies.
Yeah, he actually, a lot of the things he did in the movie were real. He did drag some crew members to safety. He risked his life to help the wounded ship captain. And of course, he mans the anti aircraft gun, as we see.
Yes, we do see, and it's. I remember cheering for him when I saw it the last time I saw it. So,
Yeah,
like, yes, go get him. I wish we'd learned a little bit more about him. Though, to be honest, his story is probably one of the more true in the movie, which is interesting.
you're right. Yeah, it's all of our main characters are pretty much fictitious, but a lot of the background characters are not. Like the commanding officers on the ships are generally based on real people. The Japanese bomber pilot whose face we see, that's based on a real guy. So, yeah, I mean that aspect of it is pretty cool. So, just to kind of in that vein give a little bit more information on what happened at Pearl Harbor. So, it was a 2-hour attack. Around 6:40 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward was on patrol near the entrance of Pearl Harbor, and they were alerted to the presence of a small Japanese submarine. They opened fire, the sub disappeared, and they did report the encounter, but the commanders were slow to react. So, about 20 minutes later, radar operators pick up Japanese planes 140 miles out. But again, these reports get brushed aside because they believe that they're American planes. And apparently, so in this National Geographic documentary, they also interviewed a Japanese pilot, and he was talking about how when they were started getting close to Hawaii, they could pick up like Hawaiian music on the American radio stations. He was just telling this kind of surreal story about how, they're flying towards Hawaii and they're listening to the Hawaiian music in the
Dancing
plane.
in the plane.
Yeah, they're
Wow.
following the music. I was like, this is
Right.
bizarre. But yeah, so 45 minutes later, the attack began. The Japanese force included 6 aircraft carriers plus support ships and 350 planes, and they had to travel around 3,000 miles to get there. This was obviously a huge endeavor, required tons of foreplanning, and they managed to sink or damage 21 American ships, including all 8 US battleships. They sunk 4 of them and damaged the remaining 4. They destroyed or damaged more than 300 aircraft, and they killed 2,400 Americans, injuring 1,178 more. And the Japanese lost just 29 planes.
Wow.
So,
So is that only 29 people then? Are there more, or is there more than one person in the plane?
well, I suppose it depends. So, if it was a bomber, it would have more than one person in the plane. But if it was
Right.
a fighter plane, it would just have one.
But still, if
So,
you compare those numbers, the Japanese won that battle.
right. Well, I mean, they really took them by surprise, right? Which was the point, I guess.
Yeah.
So initially, this was viewed as a success for the Japanese. It did what they wanted it to do, which was they got the US on the back foot, and they were able to use that to capture many current or former Western colonies by early 1942, including Burma, which is now Myanmar, British Malaysia, which is now Malaysia and Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and the Philippines. So that had been a big goal of theirs. The attack itself ended up shaking the US out of its isolationist policies. They hadn't even begun to sell military supplies to Britain until 1939. They were pretty set on this we're not getting involved situation until Pearl Harbor. And unfortunately for Japan, they did not completely destroy the US fleet. They missed some crucial repair shops and some fuel oil tanks. And their failure to take out US aircraft carriers was a mistake that really cost them at the Battle of Midway 6 months later in June of 1942.
It's so hard to imagine that the Americans just did not see it coming at all.
Well,
Or,
apparently, the way that it was set up was Kimmel who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. He had this really predictable schedule set up where most of the ships spent every weekend at harbor. So the Japanese knew that if they attacked on Sunday morning, all the ships would be there, which
right.
is
and they can't exactly go anywhere because they're all stuck in the harbor too.
And because it was Sunday, a lot of the men were sleeping in the barracks. And so they were just sitting ducks for the Japanese to bomb the shit out of them. So the movie picks up December 8th, 1941 in Washington, because no Pearl Harbor movie would be complete without the famous FDR speech where he declares war on the Empire of Japan. And he says his famous December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, which I'm pretty sure everyone's heard a clip of that speech at some point or other.
Even me.
You actually, just out of curiosity, this is a total sidebar, but did you learn about Pearl Harbor in school?
I did not, no. So I think I guess the first time I learned about Pearl Harbor was by watching Pearl Harbor, which is
Wow,
wild.
interesting.
And
I'm sure.
I'm trying to remember if I looked up anything after that, but I think I was too young. I think at 14 I didn't really care.
Yeah.
And but thankfully I also did not really remember, so all the inaccuracies didn't really stick with me. So yeah,
Yeah.
I
I'm
think I think I think it's more damaging for like people who are like 18 or 17 who are kind of already in that spot where they could find it interesting but also believe it was all truthful, kind of. I think maybe at 14 it wouldn't be so bad, but when you're just slightly older and you believe it, then it's kind of harmful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was mentioned in school, but all of our history and social studies stuff was very Canada centric. So I'm sure it was mentioned in the context of like, here's why the Americans got involved in the war, but it was definitely not an in-depth topic of conversation.
Editing Maartje here to kind of intervene because we were getting a little sidetracked. This is me going back into the movie. We're still in December. We're somewhere between December and April of 1941 and April 1942. And it's the harbor's been and gone. And Evelyn reveals to Rafe, not to Danny, that she's pregnant with Danny's child. I don't know why she would, but she does. She's like, guess what? I'm pregnant, but it's not yours. And she also tells Rafe that she's gonna stay with Danny because he's the father of her future son. So
You know why
Rafe
she
is
tells
kind of
Rafe that? For drama.
fair. That's fair. That's
Some
actually
screenwriter was
probably
like, we're gonna fuck him up with this one.
like Rafe really can't catch a break, can he? Like he crashes over the channel. He comes back miraculously, and then his girlfriend has cheated on him with his best friend, and now
Well,
she's
she didn't
pregnant.
cheat on him. She thought he was dead.
Well, fair. That's true. I
That's
don't
not
know.
listen,
You're
real
right.
life is not Titanic. You're not going to know a guy for 4 weeks and then just declare celibacy and remain
You're
unwed for
right.
life and go to a
You're right.
convent.
You're right. I can't stop laughing. So she doesn't tell Danny, which I think is a mistake, because then Danny and Rafe get kind of assigned or asked to join up to the secret mission with Doolittle, which is going to be a morale boosting raid on. But Rafe the entire time keeps telling Danny that he shouldn't be going on this mission, and then he's like, God, you don't think I can do this? Like, he's kind of upset. Like, you've been looking after me my entire life. I can do something by myself. So they both go. And the most cliche line of the movie actually happens on this raid. And I'm wondering if you know which one I mean.
Oh gosh, I
Like,
don't know. But I haven't seen this movie 100 times.
no, but you know which one it is because it's Doolittle and he says something very American. We're gonna win this war. You know why? Because of them. Then he points kind of to Rafe and Danny. It's
I
just
did
so
specifically call out that line because okay, so Mart had gone to bed because she's 6 hours ahead of me. So I was watching this movie and just like sending her a barrage of messages as things occurred to me in the film. And I definitely wrote out that specific quote. I was like, this is so cheesy. Oh my God.
and I feel like Alec Baldwin is just like so typically American in this too. It's like
Oh
he's got like the
God, he's
blue eyes.
brutal.
Yeah. So
He really plays like a cardboard cutout of a CEO. He's just so he's not good. You know, it's not his best work.
it just feels very kind of flat too. I don't really believe anything he's saying. But
Yeah.
anyway, they go on this mission and they train to take short takeoffs from on modified bombers. I'm not sure if they had them in real life. Probably not. I'm guessing.
Well, they did. Yeah, but So at the time, no pilot had ever flown a bomber into combat from the deck of an aircraft carrier. So
Right.
they did have to do quite a lot of training. I believe they did the training in Florida and they had to learn how to take off these really short runways.
We see a little bit of that, and actually, it takes quite long in the movie. I feel like this could have been like a separate movie almost. Like it deserved more
100%.
to.
Yeah. I think the Doolittle
Yeah,
raid should have been separate.
yeah. So they we see them training, and then we see them getting into position slowly, but then their position is given away because they get spotted, I believe, by a Japanese sailor. And then they have to take off sooner than they were expected to, which is important because it means that they won't have enough fuel to return to or to fly to wherever they were going to fly to after the raid. And you kind of see it coming. You kind of start thinking, "Oh God, these guys aren't going to make it back." So that's kind of the point, I guess, of this film, is that you're just emotionally invested, kind of, and then you think, "God, they're going to die, aren't they?" So they go on this raid, and it's successful initially. They do hit Tokyo, I believe, but then they have nowhere to go because they're out of fuel, and they crash on. The mission is actually on April 18th in 1942, and they crash in Japanese occupied China. They're like, maybe we'll get picked up by the Chinese instead. You think it looks kind of hopeful for a while, and then he actually saves Ray's life, but then Danny is very dramatically and fatally shot, and he dies. And after
Wah wah.
that, womp womp. And of course, Rafe tells him just before he dies that he's gonna make it because he's gonna be a dad, and it's like a whole thing. But he dies anyway, so it's kind of sad. And then,
Genuinely one of my least favorite, just because it's so overused, this trope of like failure to communicate. It's like so much of this could have been resolved if Danny had just been told that he was going to be a dad earlier in the movie. And like, why didn't they tell him? Literally no reason, just for drama.
drama, right? Yeah. And then actually, Rafe returns home to Evelyn, and they kind of get reacquainted. And then we skip to sometime post war. We don't know when, but we see them in a plane with a tiny little boy called Danny.
So, believe it or not, the first 90 minutes of this movie is not Pearl Harbor. And then there's about 40 minutes of Pearl Harbor. And then the last like 45 or 50 minutes is not Pearl Harbor again.
It's true. Like for a movie called Pearl Harbor, there's quite little of Pearl Harbor actually in it. We haven't even talked about the nurses in this movie. The nurses have like a whole plot of their own. Kind of
Yeah,
how
so we
they're
definitely see Evelyn stepping up and taking charge during Pearl Harbor, and some of her nurse friends get a little bit fleshed out anyways. One of them ends up being killed, I believe, in the attack. So yeah, we do get some ladies in World War II in this movie. That is a thing I enjoy.
and they also have like good dialogue at some point. So it's not then they're all very pretty, but they're not there to be just pretty. Almost.
Well, you and I might disagree on whether they have good dialogue, but I mean, it was nice
Well,
to see them in the movie.
maybe they have at least they have dialogue. I'll leave it at that. I think that's at least true.
Yeah,
And
it's, not to get too far into it, but, they at least do have some conversations amongst themselves. They're not just,
talking to the men, I know.
right.
And I think that at least Evelyn gets to at least take charge and also tell the doctors what to do in this movie, which I thought was kind of funny. Like,
Yeah, it was nice to see because there were a lot of nurses who took very heroic actions at Pearl Harbor. I mean, they didn't obviously know this was going to happen either, and just to be thrown into this horrific
right,
situation where people are just coming in by the boatload with terrible burns and all these wounds that you've never treated before, and you're having to do triage. So there were a
right.
lot of real life heroic nurses at Pearl Harbor.
I do believe they had a nurse consultant or two nurse consultants on this movie that were actually stationed at Pearl Harbor during the war. That really surprised me. At least I didn't get to look into it, but I think that's correct. So that's interesting that they got like at least some consulting done by people who were actually there.
Yeah, that's really good, actually. In my National Geographic doc, they also interviewed quite a few nurses who were there because there were tons of them stationed there. And some of it was grim. I mean, one of them was talking about how she was like, I don't know if I should say this, but there were so many casualties, we were stacking them like cordwood at the back of the
Ah,
hospital.
that's horrible.
Yeah.
God. But speaking of the hospital, there were some historical inaccuracies there. Apparently, I see you've written it down. I've also looked this up. Apparently, the Japanese did not target the naval hospital directly, even though the movie makes it seem like they did. And I read somewhere that only edited to make the attack look more brutal, as if it needed to be any more brutal.
Right. In real life, only one member of the medical staff was killed, apparently. I think that we would be remiss not to have a brief discussion about whether in a project like this, close adherence to history matters and how close it needs to be, what degree of historical accuracy is important versus what kind of story you want to tell.
Definitely. I do have some opinions about this. I sometimes feel like you can forgo some historical accuracy in service of narrative, but this movie does not do that. It's just narrative, and it doesn't it's not it's so inaccurate. I mean, I enjoy it as a movie, but when I think about what actually happened, it's kind of bad that I didn't make a better effort to make it more realistic, I think. It doesn't really
Yeah,
serve the narrative. Like, the narrative always seems to be separate from the actual historical events.
right. They're kind of using the backdrop of Pearl Harbor to tell this love story, but at the same time, arguably the best part of the movie is that 40-minute sequence where Pearl Harbor is actually happening. And I mean, that's probably because it was directed by Michael Bay and that's what he's good at, but
Right. Yes, I just wish that they made it so that Pearl Harbor was actually more the center of the story, and maybe I don't mind a romance on the side because it helps you kind of feel for the characters and get to know them and know what motivates them and stuff. But the romance was so prevalent in this movie compared to the actual historical happenings that I thought they could have done a better job marrying the
yeah.
two, so to say.
And I agree with you that if it serves the narrative, if you're making a movie like this, it's not a documentary. You're obviously trying to tell a story. And so if you have to maybe amalgamate a couple of characters to make the story cleaner and easier to understand, if there's some guy who happens to be smoking a cigarette that wasn't available till 1970 or whatever, that kind of stuff doesn't really bother me. It's not a huge deal. But there are some things where you kind of have to think about what the purpose of your movie is. Like, do you just want to make a cool 40-minute action sequence and call it Pearl Harbor? Like, okay, that's fine if that's your goal. But if you want to serve the real people who were there and tell their story, which Michael Bay professes to want to do, then I do think you do have some burden towards actually trying to be historically accurate. I mean, if you can go out of your way to get something wrong, then you can go out of your way to get it right.
I feel like he didn't really do that. Even if you look back at the publications of the time, loads of veterans just refused to watch it because it was so inaccurate. We're just not serving any of them. It just
Right, even stuff like the movie does a thing where they kind of set it up. This is funny to me because this to me is how you can tell this is an American movie because they periodically have these sequences of newsreel clips that are telling you what's going on in the war as if, you just super broad stroke stuff too, as if, you might not know anything about World War II, which is, I mean, I guess it helps people to understand the story and place it in the broader framework. But a lot of the news clips they use are from later in the war. They do stuff like they painted the Japanese Zeros green because it looked better. It would help audiences differentiate them from the good guys. And there's a few instances where they used modern warships that wouldn't have been built until much later. So they did all these things where it's like, y'all, it would have been easy to just get that one right, you know?
and it's also it makes you wonder if it needs all that stuff too. Like, is all of this really necessary? Like all of the things that he got wrong. Could he have just left it out and still have a good story? Probably, because a lot of it's just embellishment. A lot of it's just let's make this more gruesome than it already is, basically. So I'm like, right, you really need to blow up more stuff, even if
Yeah.
that
Well,
didn't
and
happen.
even our main characters, apparently, when Pearl Harbor actually happened, there were these two US Army Air Force second lieutenants named George Welch and Kenneth M. Taylor, who did a lot of those heroic acts in the P-40 aircraft at Pearl Harbor. That was similar to what Rafe and Danny did in the film. And they actually won the Distinguished Service Cross. So why not tell the real story of those guys, you know?
Right. I agree. I do feel like I enjoy this movie like as a movie, but not as an historical movie. Like
Right.
if it had been a fictional movie, just completely fictional with a battle in it, I would have been fine with it. But because it actually happened, I take offense with
Yeah.
it.
I mean, they also the macro stuff too, and again, like some of the minor stuff where it's like, oh, they use a Spitfire that wasn't available yet during Ben Affleck's European fight scenes, like whatever. But there's things like it really dramatizes Japan's capabilities, which I think is partly to, make some people feel better potentially about what happened at the end of the war. But someone says something like, they could expand as far as Chicago before we could stop them. But even in real life, Yamamoto, who was the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, he was actually quoted as saying, in reference to the Americans, I can raise havoc with them for 1 year or at most 18 months. After that, I can give no one any guarantees. I mean, there was a reason why it was a surprise attack, right? Like the Japanese knew that one on one, they were not winning that one.
They didn't have the stamina to keep fighting this war for a long time. They just had to have
Right,
the element of surprise. I do wonder
right.
though, in the movie, one of the Japanese commanders, when they're talking about starting a third wave, he actually says, "Let's not do a third wave because the element of surprise is gone." Wonder if that actually happened.
Yeah, I do remember that happening in the movie. I don't know if that happened.
Right. Okay.
But I mean,
Yeah.
even they in the movie too, we get the super facile explanation of why the Japanese want to go to war. They seem very reluctant and noble, and we have no choice. We're going to war because the Americans cut off our oil. But in real life, Japan at this point, and to be fully clear, they were completely following the example of Western powers, including the United States. They were interested in expanding their empire. So they had already fought all these imperialist wars in the late 19th century, and they were trying to look after their economic interests. So the US, which had been a major exporter of metal to Japan, had imposed economic sanctions in 1940. And in 1941, they ended trade with Japan. They froze their overseas assets and they placed an oil embargo on them, along with several other countries, to essentially curtail Japan's imperialistic ambitions. It's okay for Western powers and European powers to have colonies, but, woe betide anyone
Japan
else who tries.
yeah, Japanese can have the same. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So of course, this stirred up all this anti-American feeling in Japan. They felt that Westerners were meddling in Asian affairs, and each time the Americans did something else, the Japanese responded by seizing further colonial assets. And then in September of 1940, they signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. And given the choice between abandoning completely its imperial aims in Asia and having its economy collapse, they decided, look, we're going to try and expand, get access to new resources, expand our sphere of influence by taking control of parts of Southeast Asia. And the US had such a strong presence in the Pacific and had already interfered economically with Japan that they decided their only option was, we'll try and take them out for long enough for us to consolidate our gains and take control of all of these colonies. And that's basically what they did.
Right. So the movie really makes it seem like it's almost kind of petty that they're doing this attack over just oil, but it's not just about oil.
Right. And I mean, as
Right.
early as 1906, the US had begun planning for potential war in Japan. They actually had this series of joint US and Navy plans called War Plan Orange that picked up steam during the interwar years. So they envisioned this whole war breaking out between the US and Japan, culminating in this massive high seas battle. Like, people knew that this was coming. This was really not.
Something we didn't talk about, but what I thought was kind of interesting was the peace talks that were going on as Japan was preparing to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I think the movie does do it really clever. Even though it's very long, I think the lead up to Pearl Harbor is quite interesting from the Japanese point of view, at least. I do wonder if that was actually a trick or not, but to distract them from actually discovering them.
Yeah, I mean, the sense that I got, of course, Pearl Harbor was an extremely sophisticated attack, so the Japanese were planning it for a long time. They knew that was going to happen, but in order for it to be a surprise, I'm sure you have to maintain some semblance of diplomacy. But I mean, in real life, like in the movie, they make Yamamoto seem pretty reluctant to take on the Americans, but in real life, he actually threatened to resign if they didn't attack Pearl Harbor.
Because in the movie, he's like, He's also almost kind of modest about what they're able to do. And then he says the line about waking up a sleeping giant. That's him, right? Who says it?
It is him who says it, which is apparently not based on real life. It's based on a 1970 movie called Tora Tora Tora.
Which comes up when you look up IMDb and you look at the references that our friend the director has looked up. That comes up as a movie that he's watched to get
Yeah.
inspired to make this movie. So that makes sense.
So should we rate this movie then?
We should definitely rate this movie. We have a new rating system, guys.
We do.
Oh wait,
So we I think we started this last time. We decided that we're going to
we
rate
did, we did.
we're going to rate based on something relevant to the movie or TV show. So in this case, we've decided that we're going to rate Pearl Harbor on presumed deaths out of 10.
Right, that's
So
ridiculous.
how many presumed deaths out of 10 would you rate this movie?
God, that's actually really difficult because I like it as a movie, but I hate it as a piece of war media. And what do I do about this? I think I would give it probably a 4. But then I do really like the movie as a movie and as a nostalgic piece. I'm gonna pull it up to a 6. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll be honest. I got to the end of the movie. I watched that first 90 minutes. I was really suffering by the time Pearl Harbor happened. And then I did enjoy Pearl Harbor. I thought the action sequences were well done. And then immediately after Pearl Harbor, I was bored again. And I started looking at my phone, which is never a good sign. So
Oh no.
this movie, I'm gonna give it 3 presumed deaths out of 10. And it gets that 3 because of the action sequences.
And because of the song at the very end of the movie.
Yeah, the song is actually a tune. What's it called again?
There You'll Be, I believe.
There You'll Be. Yeah, There You'll Be is a tune. And actually, we should shout out the rest of the music in this movie also because it's Hans Zimmer. The score is very good.
It is very good. So if I were to quickly sum up what I liked about this movie, mostly it's the cinematography. It's really pretty. The music is really good. And I guess some of the scenes with Rafe and Evelyn are kind of sweet and funny. And that's mostly what I like about it. And also the way it makes me feel like I'm 14 again. So
Yeah, I'll be fair to this movie. I might have liked it better at 14, but I'll be honest, I don't know if I would have been able to sit through it.
it's not your kind of movie.
No, I mean I've said this before. I'm really into action movies and I don't really care for this romantic shoehorning of this boring flat love triangle, but to each their own.
Perfect. It's rated.
Sorry, I really came for this movie that you like.
It's okay. I'll keep it in my 14-year-old pocket somewhere.
Do you want to ask me what I'm reading? I would ask you, but
Yes, no, ask me because I'm actually reading something.
oh, what are you reading?
I'm reading a Dutch book called Oorlogstijd by Onno Blom. It's actually like a family story. It's about his grandfather and all his siblings during the war. Grandfather was part of the resistance in the Netherlands, and the rest of the brothers and sisters were all part of the NSB, which is the Socialist Party that sided with the Germans during World War II. And it's just a really interesting family dynamic. I actually reached out to the publisher to try and see if there's an English copy that you could read so we could talk about it on the show. I know.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah. So what are you reading?
I am reading a book called A Short History of Progress by Ronald Wright, who is a Canadian writer who's written a lot of fiction and nonfiction about anthropology and civilizations and history. And he wrote another book called What is America that I read during university that I really enjoyed. And I looked it up again recently, and apparently it's sort of a spiritual sequel to A Short History of Progress. So I picked up both books. I'm going to give them a read. I just started it, but I'm enjoying it so far.
Why are you so smart? Can you just stop being so smart? You make me feel kind of stupid, to be honest.
What? Why?
Just because you know so much. I feel like I don't retain as much information as you do. I'm just kind of envious, but in a good way. I'm happy that you're my friend. You get to be the smart one and I'll be the stupid one. It's fine.
No, not the stupid one. I just retain a lot of information, and I've said this before. When I go to trivia every week, I'm always the one who knows all the useless facts. And I'm always like, you know what? Thank God I was born in this era, because any earlier and I would have for sure been burned as a witch.
Thank you everyone for listening to our very extensive review of Pearl Harbor. It was about as long as the movie, so I apologize for that. And I hope you
You're
enjoyed
gonna
it
edit it. You're
anyway.
gonna make me sound smart. You're gonna take out all my rambling.
And mine, because I was also rambling quite a lot. But I still hope you all enjoyed it. And you can, as you know, you can subscribe to our podcast on just about any podcast platform.
You can give us a follow on Rosie the Reviewer podcast on Instagram, and feel free to drop us a line if you have any comments or questions or things you want us to talk about. If you can give us 5 stars on the listening app of your choice, that would be super. And next week, I believe we're going to cover Saving Private Ryan.
Exciting.
I'll tell you a secret. I haven't seen that movie, so I'm very excited.
Oh my God.
I know.
You have
Don't
not
come for
seen
me.
it? Right. So that'll be fun. See you next week, guys.
Bye.